Leviathans. I don't know who this is by. I was 4 years old when I first dreamed of the Leviathans. The details grew fuzzy now, as all memories that old do. I was dreaming of something else at the time, something unrelated but just as strange. They were flickering dreams, switching and shifting, dreams that would have terrified me if my brain had been cruel enough to remember them. Dreams of worlds gone dark, of eerie landscapes under alien skies, of small places in the plains and forests that were not what they seemed at all. And through it all, something watched me, tall and green, like a hybrid of a bat and cicada. Sometimes it was close, sometimes it was far away. I even think I remember it speaking to me once, though I do not remember what it said. But I remember that it was, in some way, connected to the dream that came next. The dream that was more than a dream, that dream that was a memory that has stayed with me clear as a glass bauble ever since. I was older, perhaps in my teens. Water pressed mercilessly against my body, and though I could breathe through a tube in my mouth, I knew I had only minutes to live. But right then, I didn't care about that. All I cared about was the vast darkness of my surroundings, an impossible, crushing dark, so thick I couldn't see my body or the ground I stood upon. That dark stretched into the sky, forming a perfect, unbroken dome. Or perhaps not quite unbroken. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw there was a glow before me. It was faint, so faint as to almost be imperceivable. But it was undeniably there, turning the water there to an impossibly dark midnight blue instead of black. But that was not what made me gasp in awe, or what made me remember that moment to this day. It was in fact that before the glow, shapes moved. They were colossal ancient things, towering miles above the sea floor, so huge that I could not see their shape if they hadn't been so far away. There was something in them of whales, the vast blue or finned whales. But they were not those creatures, as much as I tried to tell myself they were, nor were they giant squids or deep-sea shrimp or rotten mats of vegetation, though they resembled all these things as well in their own way. But they were alive, I know that. Their limbs moved, though impossibly slowly. Their tails beat up and down in strokes that took minutes to complete. Tiny lights, like distant stars, flickered from their sides, and those structures that were not their heads. Once one of them opened their mouth, and the motion it made to do so sickens me to this day. They were not whales. They were my Leviathans. I don't know how many there were. Half a dozen, at least. A pod of impossible things slowly moving along. Perhaps there were more around me, invisible in the darkness. Perhaps they stretch on forever in that crushing, suffocating shadow. I didn't know, and I never will, for it was then that I awoke. At the time, of course, I brushed the experience off as a strange dream. I had told my parents in my disjointed, childish way, and they smiled indulgently, stroking my head and letting me finish my breakfast. Even I expected to forget it by the end of the day, after spending the waking world playing with toys and preschool friends. But I did not forget. A week later, I dreamed the dream again. The other dreams were not there. I was simply dreaming of time spent on the playground, of small, innocent things a child dreams of. But I turned around, and there they were again. My Leviathans, moving slowly along, vast things in the crushing dark. Perhaps they had some purpose, moving there through the water. Perhaps they communicated in some way I had no method of perceiving, or perhaps my brain idly thought they were not even alive at all. I could never tell when they would return. It wasn't always a dream. Sometimes it would be a daydream or a sudden, powerful flashback. I found myself doodling them, these huge shapes looming across the page, trying to pick out their exact details. Anything else I would have been unable to draw from memory, but this was like a movie playing in my head that I could go back to and replay at any time. Slowly, over dozens of iterations, they finally became clear. My mother found these drawings, scattered over my room while I was at school. I always feared that she would suspect something was wrong with me. After all, why would I draw the same, entirely imaginary thing? But when I asked, she sat down at the table with one of the drawings in her hand, looking at me. Why would anything be wrong? Because I've just been drawing the same thing over and over and over. What's wrong with that? Sometimes it takes an artist a long time to portray that in what's in their imagination. The important thing is that you're practicing, and you're getting better every time. But shouldn't I be learning to draw other things? Do you want to? I thought about that for a few minutes. Then I smiled and shook my head. No. She smiled and handed me back the drawing. Through middle and high school, I had two loves, art and marine biology. I was obsessed with the ocean, with the strange things that moved within it and the mysteries that lurked unsolved in its depth, but my true gift proved to be with a pencil or a paintbrush. I put that gift to good use, drawing flowers and figures and landscapes as my teachers requested. I even had a private tutor when I was in high school, and though we may not have parted on the best terms, I credit so many of my current abilities to him, both artistic and otherwise. I only knew him for 4 years, but the impact he had on my life was indescribable. The first time I went to learn with him, I simply sat at a table in his cozy studio. Paintings of strange things hung from the wall, things whose identity you could almost discern, but not quite. His old Tammy cat slept in front of a crackling fire, and his soft, soothing voice traversed the entire place like the mahogany finish that colored it. I simply sat there, pencil in hand, and he stood at his easel, not even watching me, simply adding yellow spirals to whatever strange, impossible image he was creating. What should I draw? I asked him, staring blankly at the page before him. He shrugged, not even turning to me. Whatever you want. The first thing that comes to your mind. Felix, if you'd like. I looked at Felix the cat, upside down on the hearth, feet in the air as he snored lightly. He was cute in his way, but I didn't want to draw him. I wanted to draw my Leviathans. And so I did. My pencil picked out the familiar curved lines, the strange strills that were neither limb nor tentacles, the eyeless faces, the finned tail. They marched, a whole pod of them, across the page, and before them grew a landscape. It was not in my memory, but it flowed out of me, a strange, beautiful panorama, accentuating their titanic size. There were cities there, beneath the sea, and though I did not know what inhabited them, I knew it was not people. Mountains loomed, deep trenches disappeared into gaping maws of dark shadow. Shapes that were not fish darted between rippling stems that were neither kelp nor eels. And far, far above, over the surface of the water. Miss Clementine? Yes? I jumped at the sound of the tutor's voice. What is it? Our time for today is up, I'm afraid. His voice slowed and stopped. He looked at the drawing, pondering it, until he spoke. 2 suns. I'm sorry. 2 suns, one above the other, rising over the water. Oh, I said, astonished, and immediately started scribbling away. Of course. How had he known exactly what was needed? I finished, holding up my creation with a grin of triumph, and he smiled as well, watching me. Now, I think you should sign it. I thought about it for a long time, staring down at the smudged, scribbled page, and then, after a moment, I bent down and, in the tiniest bottom corner, I drew a little rose, my middle name. He smiled knowingly and winked at me. Run along now, Miss Clementine. Wouldn't want to keep your mother waiting. I studied under him for 4 years, 4 of the happiest years of my life. I lived for that hour a week that I went to draw with him and learned what he had to teach me. We always did something different every time, never what I expected, but always somehow what I needed. Sometimes he taught me fundamentals. I would draw a mug or a flower, or Felix's fluffy self, and he would teach me about perspective and shading and color. Sometimes he would encourage me to simply draw, to go wherever my imagination took me, and it always took me to some very strange places. And then, just after I turned 18, he gave me a special assignment, something I had never done before. Miranda, he said, looking at me as I closed the door and set down my backpack, I have something of an idea for today, something I wouldn't normally suggest. What is it? I sat down expectantly at the table, looking at him. His assignments could be strange, but they were never boring. I would like to switch pieces. What? I stared at the half-finished painting he was working on. The first of strokes of a huge, titanic thing looming against swirling clouds. Sir, I'm not nearly that talented. Oh, you're not, are you? He smiled at me. In a way he did, indulgent and mischievous, as though if you weren't in on the secret yet, you would be in a minute. Are you saying I haven't taught you well enough? Well, no, sir, of course not. I have taught you everything I have. My knowledge rests in you, and not to mention everything that you've accumulated from elsewhere. There is no one else in this world I would trust to make the piece of art what it was truly meant to be. I opened and closed my mouth, looking at the thing. A part of me wanted to keep protesting, even though I knew he was right, whether or not he was exaggerating. But there was a part of me, the artist's heart, that looked at the shape and saw what it could be, that saw the way the lines would flow, the way the colors would bend and swirl together, the way the mass of the creature would loom in the half-light under whatever alien landscape, looked up at it in awe. Almost without thinking, I nodded and picked up the brush. He smiled and leaned back in his chair. 4 hours it took me to finish that painting. 4 hours to take the first light lines and mold and build them into something vast, ancient, and strange. A city sprawled below it, a city that could never exist, for only a madman would build such a thing. And behind the clouds were sparkling moons and alien stars. It was eerie. It was impossible. It was beautiful. I sat down in the chair, exhausted but proud of my work. My teacher stood, hands behind his back, and walked over to it, staring at my drying paint. His eyes ran across it, taking in its details, and I could almost see him making notes in his head. And when he turned back, he was smiling, a genuine smile of pride that made my insides swell and burst with warm, golden glow. Well done, Miranda, well done. There is emotion here, that sense of scale that you capture with such masterful ease, placed beautifully within the scene that hooks the viewer and tells them a story. Well done. What do you call it? The painting? I looked at it for a long time, pondering, before the words came half-bidden to my mouth. Lost Omandia. He turned, without an ounce of hesitation, and wrote my words in a delicate hand at the bottom left corner. As he finished, I stood walking around the table to see what had become of my piece. It had started its life as a butterfly, its wings spread across the page, but under my teacher's hand it had become something more, a spiraling, fratical thing. Wings somehow sparkling with colors despite the medium of charcoal. Whole worlds lurked in those wings, small strokes of granite telling tales I could not begin to guess at, and describing creatures that were alien even to me. My butterfly was a map of the cosmos, a field guide, a history book, a beautiful movie, a story long forgotten, and still, somehow, in a way, a butterfly. My teacher grinned slightly, watching my reaction. My apologies, Miranda. I didn't quite get time to finish it. I had no words. I just looked at his creation, my creation in some ways, and all I could say was a faint, awestruck, wow. He came around the table, put his hand on my shoulder. We have a gift, you and I. I do not think I was wrong in believing that you have seen more than some would have considered your share. What do you mean? I looked up at him, but his face swam and blurred, the remembered Leviathans so intense I struggled to see past them. Whales. You can draw so many things, Miranda, but you always come back to whales. But not real whales, no. At least, not real here. Wait, what do you know about them? The whales? Oh my goodness, nothing at all. Not more than what you've drawn, but I know about other things. I know about my clawing ones, my star beasts, the things that call themselves Odocaths. I know what really happened to Atlanta. And do you know how I know all this? I shook my head, staring into his strange dark eyes. He smiled. Neither do I. But, he said, raising a hand slightly, we are not alone in our talents. Far from it. And if you would accompany me, Miranda, I would like to make a proposal, a scholarship, if you will, to a very specific university, where talents like yours grow and blossom, and those who see into the void learn to understand what they behold. Think about it, Miranda. You could learn to truly share your Leviathans with the world. Hold up. I raised a hand and sat down in the chair. You're talking about this stuff like you think it's real. Do you think it isn't? Well, of course. I didn't know whether I did or not, but it felt almost jarring to hear it from him. And what makes you think so when whales walk in your dreams? I sat there for a long time, staring up at him. I wanted to believe him. I think I did believe him. Somewhere deep down, and there were times in my life when I would have let that belief surface, but at that particular moment, a million reasons were flashing through my head as to why I shouldn't. Was he testing me? Would he tell others? Was I really going to throw out my plans? My already accepted application for a college and a life I never even heard of? Sir, I stood up, hesitantly, my mind awash with racing thoughts. Why would he say these things? What was this college he was talking about? Who was he? Did I even know his name? Sir, I'm sorry. I think I'll have to decline. His face said everything that it needed to. Sadness, regret, apology, a hint of betrayal. I understand, Miranda. I wish you the best of luck with whatever you choose to make. You will bring great things to the world. He smiled, ever so slightly. I am sure of it. I have regretted that decision many times over the years. I regretted it when the college I chose was almost laughably easy, When my art classmates would hold up depictions of furniture or friends or cats, that always somehow reminded me of Felix, and my Leviathans would get reactions of mixed awe and confusion. I regretted it when I delved deeper and deeper into my marine biology minor, when I explored the tree of life of the deep, shadowy ocean and learned with growing frustration that no creature, living or dead, had ever borne even the slightest resemblance to the creature whose appearance only grew stronger in my mind. More than once, as I struggled through all-nighters and cram sessions, the question passed through my mind of what those at my tutor's college would have said in answer to my ever stranger and more desperate questions. And strangely enough, as I grew more and more lost and frightened of the mundanity of the world, the shell I had at 18 started to break down. Slowly, seeping through my mind, came the idea that these creatures might not be so impossible after all. It came to a head one morning, midway through my junior year. I spent hours making phone calls and doing Google research, trying to search for any trace of my tutor. My mother remembered him, of course, but at some point in the shuffle of life, his contact information had been lost. The internet yielded nothing but a grainy picture of an art piece that might have been his, with nothing leading on from it but a dead link. I could find nothing that sounded like his college at all. But the idea had forced itself into my mind. I would draw my Leviathans again, not from memory this time, for I now believed it is memories, a memory that is not mine. I would draw them from life. Somehow I would see them once. I have to, and I swore to myself that I would see them again. During my senior year, an opportunity came to my attention. My school participated in a project which organized research expeditions, including, to my great interest, one that involved exploring the Romanche Trench along the mid-Atlantic ridge. Several students, along with two of the world's most renowned marine biologists, Dr. Edwin Key and Dr. Angeline Heathers, would be making multiple dives into the deepest part of the Atlantic. At the time, my excitement was almost entirely academic. I knew there was nothing down there. Of course there wasn't. Nothing would live that far down. Nothing but bacteria and the occasional worm or crab. But the idea flickered nonetheless. The faint hope that somewhere down there, my Leviathans would be waiting. And somehow, despite the struggle and the hard work and the enormous amount of luck, I was one of the lucky few aboard the ship, sailing from Rio towards the hidden place in the rippling silence of the sea. Those days in the Grandfather are days I will never forget. She was a rickety old thing, and her crew was old salts whose English was broken, but whose Portuguese was a rippling font of strange tales of the sea. Her engines ground and churned. Her black smoke made another cloud against the sunset. I remember I spent that week sitting on the deck in the shadow of the submarine, only occasionally interacting with others, just watching the ocean, my ocean, I often felt, change color from dawn to dusk to moonlit night. And then the call came, and the small ship came to a slow halt over the yawning abyss below us. All through the morning, before the first dive, there was a rippling excitement through the ship. Even the crew, who would be doing nothing but watching camera feeds and maintaining the ship, were excited. The professors had excited grins of anticipation that would never seem to properly fade. Anna Ribeiro, the submarine pilot, was a blur of activity, supervising diagnostics and preparations as she got herself and Dr. Key ready for the dive. And then, almost before we had registered what was happening, we were sitting in the submarine, and Anna and the captain talking almost incessantly to each other over the radio, as the crane ground outward and lowered us down with a splash into the sea. Down, down we went through the blue-black abyss. We were all close enough together that we had to struggle not to bump into each other. Strapped tightly into the seat and lit by the flicker and hum of the dashboard. The only way to see outside was through a tiny reinforced porthole, and though the exterior lights glowed in beams through the water, they did nothing but enhance the feeling of the blackness beyond them. There was nothing out there in the open ocean. No schools of fish, no floating plankton, nothing. Just endless blue water, so thick and dark we couldn't tell if it was day or night. We descended about 2 miles on the first day, deep enough that the submarine's lights started to glide down the rough walls of the trench. Dr. Key and I talked excitedly back and forth, pointing out anything that looked interesting, and Anna managed somehow to steer us towards it through her chatter with the captain. We found a lot that day, several new species of worm, a little wriggling fish that neither of us could quite identify, and then, quite suddenly, Anna announced, "All right, we're going to start going back up now." Already, I was almost shaken awake, my eyes having to tear themselves from the SEPA muck outside. But we've barely seen anything. It's been almost 6 hours. But there's so much more. There has to be. This can't be all of it. I leaned towards the porthole, peering out into the darkness beyond, even as I felt Dr. Key's confused eyes on the back of my head. "Miranda," he said hesitantly. "Miranda, we've done a lot today. We can go back up. You'll probably have a dissertation on the fish alone." "Fuck the dissertation!" I said, snapping around my head to face him as the seatbelts dug into me. "We can't go back now. There's still so much below us, Doctor. Water. It goes down and down and down, filled with ancient mysteries. You can't feel it? You can't feel it calling to you?" He shook his head. "Miss Romerio, just take us up." "Yes, sir." Her hands made delicate motions over the submarine's controls, and slowly the needle of the little depth gauge started to crawl upwards, back towards the hollow, empty sanity of the world above. I was quiet then. I was quiet as the submarine bobbed up to the surface, water running down in little waves down the portholes as the magnetic clamp of the crane sounded against the hull. I stayed quiet over the next week as the others descended into the dark, mysterious depths, like tiny crabs locked in a steel shell as they moved through the yawning vastness. But I was waiting. One of these days, it would be my turn again. I took up drawing again over that week. That place, the glittering water, the rickety boat floating like clouds over the deep, deep dark. It woke something in me, the same thing that had awoken in my tutor's studio all those years ago. I drew the deep depths of the trench, not the mud and the slime the submarine had clung to like a worried mouse, but the open water 5 miles down. Sometimes it would be no more than a gradient, an attempt to capture the way that the light faded into the deep, perfect blackness. But sometimes it would be other things, the huge creatures and lost civilizations I imagined deep down in the depths, on the true surface of the earth, far removed from the light, fluffy things above. And above them, as always, loomed my Leviathans, huge things moving in the distant horizon, always too far to see. And ever so slowly, as the submarine descended and rose to the surface again and again and again without me, I began to form a plan. Down again, my second actual descent into the depths, with fellow student Manuel Kittel in the seat beside me. Another 2 hours of sitting there, idly chatting as bright, glittering blue changed ever so slowly into deep, impenetrable black, and my heart beat in my ears with anticipation. Was this a good idea? Of course not. How could it be? Perhaps I had made a mistake. Perhaps I should simply let the dive go as planned. But I didn't want to do that. Whatever consequences would come of this, they would be worth it. I would make sure of that. I spent an hour with Manuel, categorizing worms and crustaceans and the occasional small fish, just the same as last time. An hour spent staring in awe at a blade of grass when an untapped jungle loomed below us. And then I slid the knife from my pocket ever so gently and held it to Anna's throat. Turn off the radio. Miss Clementine? Her voice trembled as she hesitantly obeyed, and Manuel turned to look at me in horror. Miss Clementine, what are you doing? Take us out into the canyon, into the open water, then take us down. I want to see the bottom. But... I knew what she was going to say. It was too deep. The sub would be crushed, but I didn't care. I told her so as the canyon walls swung slowly away outside. Elation was rushing through my body. At this moment, I felt in tune with everything, with the entirety of the submarine. I felt the rumbling engine, the searchlight eyes. I felt Anna's sheer terror and Manuel's gentler, somehow worse dread as I forced them to what they knew would be their deaths. I felt the trembling metal of the knife, balancing a second away from cutting Anna open, and even as I drank it all in, I knew it didn't matter. This bubble of mine, but it was nothing but a bubble when outside it was the ocean. And as the giddy sensation pumped through my body, I laughed and laughed like a child again. Down and down went the small sub, searchlights fading into the dark around them. Down, down, that depth gauge creeping higher and higher, the only visible change in tense silence. 3 miles down, 3.5, 4 glorious miles beneath the surface of the ocean. And then it went wrong. I had been holding the knife to her neck the whole time. I knew that the instant I set it down, she would go to the surface again. But it was an awkward position, and my arm was starting to get tired. And Manuel saw it. He lunged at me with the strength that I didn't know his wiry body possessed. There was a snap and a whir as his seatbelt unbuckled. And then his hand was upon my wrist and his arm around my head, both squeezing until at last I cried out in pain, Manuel, what are you doing? Shut up! Just shut up! He was breathing hard, his fingers leaving bruises around my wrist. This has gone on far enough. Just stay here. Don't talk. Don't move. Panic was flooding my brain as the submarine started to tilt upwards again. I couldn't go back up there. I couldn't go back to the fluffy, airy place where mankind crawled like lice and squabbled over scraps, where I could never, ever be down here in the beautiful black depths. And then, quite suddenly, something happened. I had squeezed my eyes shut, almost blinded by terror as I finally dropped the knife. And then the pressure was gone, and there was screaming. Not human screaming, though terror shriekings were faintly audible through it. The agonized screaming of metal in pain, crumpling and bulking under impossible pressure. My eyes snapped open. Manuel was on the floor. No, Manuel was in the floor, half his body clipping through like a bleeding glitch in reality. Anna was choking in horror, staring as her instruments went wrong, as the compass spun like a top and the depth gauge bottomed out hard enough to rattle against the casing. And around me the submarine was crumbling, folding in on itself like a crushed soda can, lights flickering out one by one as huge dents slammed in through the hull. And in the sudden darkness, I had the foresight to look out the window. Out there in the blackness, that perfect, infinite black, that the puny eyes of surface creatures could not hope to penetrate. But no, Not quite perfect, not black, a velvet dark shade of midnight blue. There were only seconds to stare out that window, but those seconds were all I needed. Death had come for me, and for the poor others I dragged along this journey. Death in the impossible abyss, in an ocean far too deep to be anywhere on Earth. But I didn't care. My life's purpose was complete. My tutor was forgiven. My artwork was vindicated. For out that window, looming far bigger than I had imagined on the horizon, were my Leviathans.